So our next guest for the next 28 minutes or so is Scott Horton. Mr. Horton is the author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and he is the editorial director of antiwar.com, which I hope that all of our listeners will visit once we are finished here. Scott, we just finished a wonderful conversation with Matthew Ho, and we want to pick it up with you. One of the leaks, if you will, we were talking about the gradual leaking of this story of the bounty plot, on U.S. military. And there was an article in the New York Times today about an individual. His last name is Azizi, and he has been involved, apparently, receiving money from the Russians for many, many years. And this is the latest chapter, if you will, on this. Could you start by just reacting briefly to the story in general on the U.S. military plot?
Well, first of all, wait, how much time do we have? Half an hour?
Yeah, we have a half hour. Yeah,
okay. Well, the first big piece is how thin the reporting is. Even with this elaboration in the Times now telling this story, there's still all kinds of disclaimers and hedges and apparentlys, and it seems like it may be so's and this kind of thing throughout the entire article. And they spent a lot of the time, just essentially filling column inches with innuendo. We talked to 6 different people who said that this guy has had more money recently. Okay. Unless they said where he got it, that's completely irrelevant. But makes a article look article length when in fact, as far as the actual substance in there, they have virtually nothing. And, well, I just don't believe it. And if they proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt somehow, then I'd believe it. But I'm sure as hell not going to believe it until after that.
Well, I'd like to jump in, Scott. It seems that there's been a total abandonment of journalistic standards and critical practice. You have stories where you have unnamed sources, anonymous officials, and the people who are quoted have skin in the game. They typically are the experts who are quoted in print or appear on television and who reaffirm these claims usually are retired generals who are on the board of military companies or residents of think tanks that receive funding from the U.S. government. Do you want to talk about journalistic standards and critical practice?
Sure. The most notable thing about this story when it first broke on the 26th and the 27th of June there was the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and then followed the next day by the Washington Post, all ran these stories. And what they had was multiple sources who were claiming that there was an intelligence report which claimed that this Russian military unit was paying bounties to militants in Afghanistan for a price on the head of dead Americans there. Mm-hmm. And then they treated that as the story itself. And in fact, the next day on Twitter, the reporters from the Post, the Times, and the Journal were all retweeting each other and saying, see, my story is now confirmed. But what part of the story was confirmed? All they were doing was they were reporting the fact that there was a rumor. They weren't reporting that it was true that the Russians had done this. They had no reason to believe that whatsoever. They were reporting the fact that somewhere there's a piece of paper that says this may be true. Big deal. In other words, why are we even talking about this at all? They have no real evidence at all. It's the same thing as, and when you talk about journalistic standards, this is how they do business all the time. Some government official claimed a thing to me, and that's the story. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just telling you it's true that he told me something, and so that should be good enough to print.
Exactly. It's reporting rumors, and it could be reporting a false story. How does this get by editors and editorial boards?
Well, they have an agenda, of course. And in this case, multiple agendas.
There you go. What's the agenda?
Well, first of all, keeping us in Afghanistan. Actually, first of all, seizing the opportunity to again portray Trump as siding with Russia over his own intelligence agencies. The same ones who falsely accused him for 3 years of being an agent of the Kremlin. You wonder why he might not believe them. But anyway, if anything that they can do to try to spin, again, to continue the Russiagate hoax, that what's wrong with Trump is somehow he's disloyal to America's national security state. And that's why he has to go. That's what the Lincoln Project is all about. All of the neocon, never Trumpers attacks against him. This is what is intolerable. His right-hand man there, Michael Flynn, who they entrapped and smeared and ran out of office there. He's a complete neoconservative lunatic. He co-wrote it, well, not really a neoconservative, but very close with them. He co-wrote a book with Michael Ledeen and has this insane obsession with Iran, where he even tried to blame Benghazi on Iran, of all things. The guy's a total Fruit Loop, and in all the worst ways, in all the most hawkish ways, helped lose both the Iraq and Afghan wars. But he wanted to get along with Russia. And he was advising Trump that, hey, if the Russians want to kill jihadists in Syria, we shouldn't stand in their way. And as far as, the temperature of things in Eastern Europe, we ought to be getting along with them. They're not going to invade Eastern Europe, and we need to ratchet things down there. And Trump thought that sounded reasonable. And then so you saw what happened. The, immune system of the national security state went into full gear against the former head of the DIA, right. A 3-star general, who you would have thought would have been immune from that level of persecution. And instead, they just went absolutely after him, because all of this translates. Your audience should be thinking right now in terms of aircraft carriers, submarines, whole new generations of long-range bombers, fighter bombers, nuclear missiles, and all of the biggest big-ticket items that the military can buy. And the military themselves, the officers and the enlisted, they all call it a self-licking ice cream cone. That means, in other words, a government program that is its own excuse for existence. And if they were ever to somehow solve their problem, they'd find a new one so that they can keep doing their job. That is, not have to get real jobs and instead cash these gigantic welfare checks. And the level of spending at $1 trillion a year, when you add up the nukes and the VA and the rest of it, it's $1 trillion a year. It's this massive distortion in America's economy toward the companies and the other special interests, the foreign governments who have a special interest in owning the policy, the American foreign policy. I've talked with a couple of experts. There's this great guy named Ben Freeman, who's been writing about the corruption of the military-industrial complex and all that. And it's not that the Israel lobby or the Saudis, have an iron grip of control over America's foreign policy. It's just that they have a lot more influence than the American people do. So Washington, D.C. is essentially this cancer, this alien thing that's been grafted on to the rest of the country that exists solely to vacuum up all of our money and to implement the policies of very narrow interests that have nothing to do with protecting the American people whatsoever.
Exactly. So the theme of our song is War is a Racket, and it's Buffy St. Marie. War is a racket. War is a business. I interviewed Bob Gates, former CIA director and DOD secretary, a while back, many years back when he came out with his book, and he actually said on air, war is a business and business is good.
On your show, he said?
He actually said that.
On the air.
On the air. Maybe this is a good time to plug your book, because because if we're not getting the truth from print journalists and from the TV pundits and talking heads, maybe it's time to read A Fool's Errand. Why don't you talk about your book for a second?
Okay, well, I started to write what was supposed to be a book about all of the terror wars, and just kind of a brief take, what you really need to know about each of them. And I got stuck on chapter 2, and it ended up evolving into an entire thing. And so it was published in 2017. And essentially, to boil it down, the argument is that the mission that the Americans have chosen is to back a coalition government of the ethnicities and tribes from the north of the country that represent, roundly speaking, about 20% of the population each in a coalition, against the plurality of the population, the 40% Pashtuns. And these are the ones that Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan backed in their Mujahideen war against the Soviet Union back in the 1980s. And we've switched sides in that war, and we lost it for the same reason that the Russians did, trying to foist this minority coalition on the plurality population of the country, and who happen to inhabit the entire countryside, and so cannot really be, contained or controlled. And so that's why it's a fool's errand, is assuming the best motives of people as far as that goes, and attempting to implement this policy. It cannot work. The only way to do it would be to kill them all, and then say, okay, in desolation there is peace. Otherwise, we could keep this up, honestly, for another 75 years and get nowhere. And so far, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and any possible peaceful settlement between the different factions on the ground there, in terms of power and tribes and ethnicities and geography and everything else, is all just being delayed indefinitely until America gets out. And even when it comes to, regional neighbors intervening there, none of them have much of a prayer of getting what they want either, but at least they have direct interests at stake. There are people who are relying on the Pakistanis to have their back, and, especially the Taliban factions. There are people who have tribes and factions that have relationships with the Iranians, with the Russians, with the Uzbeks, and whoever, who at least they have skin in the game. There's something for them, possibly to have some influence over. We're from the middle part of North America. It's just completely nuts to think that we should be in charge of dominating this region of Central Asia, or that we could ever figure out a way to resolve this civil war that
exactly
America started 40 years ago.
So the timing of these leaks and all this fake news, of course, is very suspicious because we have these impending negotiations with the Taliban and with negotiations with Russia. Does it all fit together? That this is no coincidence?
Quite possibly. I mean, if you look at how hard the military pushed Obama and Trump both in their first years in order to force them to escalate this war that was already lost even by 2009, much less 2017. They clearly have a vested interest in doing everything and are willing to do any and everything they can to stay. And after all, the deal that Trump signed with the Taliban to get us out, it's not complete. It's not meant to be complete for another 11 months from now, the end of May of next year. And so that's plenty of time for President Biden to scotch the deal, which he has vowed to do, by the way, to keep troops in Afghanistan. He says any troops he pulls out of Afghanistan, he wants to send on to Pakistan. He's lost this is the debate they had in the Obama White House 10 years ago.
Right.
And he thinks that nothing has changed since then, I guess. And of course, it's also plenty of time for Trump to back down if he's reelected too. Makes a great campaign slogan that I signed a deal to get us out of Afghanistan, but he's still got enough troops there at the Bagram Air Base to hold it and can continue to send people back. And so, if there can be a reason found to scotch this thing, they'll do it. And look at how cynical the Democrats are, where Liz Cheney, of all people, you would think that she would find some kind of puppet that she could extort and blackmail to kind of lead and do her dirty work for her in the House of Representatives so that it doesn't have the brand name Cheney on everything she does. But she doesn't care. She just leads anyway and says, listen, Democrats, let's rally around these rumors in order to stop Trump from getting out of Afghanistan. And Pelosi's Democrats go along with it. On the House Armed Services Committee yesterday, they voted for a measure to essentially try to prevent Trump from withdrawing from Afghanistan without their permission, which, of course, they have no right to do whatsoever in terms of constitutional checks and balances. The president wants to move troops. He can move them. And certainly, if Barack Obama can start two wars in Libya and Yemen without even going to Congress whatsoever, never mind the covert action in Syria, but he started two wars in Libya and Yemen without even asking permission. Now the Democrats want to say Trump can't end one without their permission. And for liberals and Democrats and progressives and leftists and whoever in the audience listening to this is who the Democratic Party is right now. Yep. Attacking Donald Trump on the right for trying to end a war that Barack Obama promised to end by 2014.
It's 9:45. If you've just joined us, we are speaking with Scott Horton. Mr. Horton is the author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and he is also the editor-director of antiwar.com. So, John, you had another question for him, I believe?
So who can we believe, Scott? Where do you get your news? The entire news apparatus has been corrupted. The intel apparatus has been corrupted. Where can the American people go for the truth?
Well, first of all, you have to read the Post and the Times and the Wall Street Journal. You have no choice, okay? They have the resources to do important work all the time, and oftentimes there's important truth in there that you have to know, but you just have to read them like you hate them, and that you don't believe a word they say, and you're always looking between the lines. You figure out who on the byline is worth listening to or not. There are people who have established real credibility even though they work for the Times, like Thomas Gibbons Neff, for example, who's a Marine Corps veteran of the Afghan War. And when he writes stuff about Afghanistan, about 98% of the time, it's solid stuff. It's not always perfect, but pretty close. But then if you're reading Michael Gordon in the Wall Street Journal, formerly of the New York Times, who lied us into war with Iraq, then you know that you can't take a word of it for granted whatsoever. But it's interesting to know what they told Michael Gordon to tell you, so you still have to read it. So it is what it is. But in terms of who do you like and who to turn to, first of all, at antiwar.com, we do a real good job every day. And we got, especially in our news department, Jason Ditz and Dave DeCamp, do great write-ups of, well, here's the story, and here's why you shouldn't believe it because of what they were saying last week, and that kind of context for you in their news summaries every day. But then, and I'm going to, kick myself later for who all I forget, but there's places like consortiumnews.com and the Great Zone Project. Joe Loria and all the guys from Robert Perry's old site at Consortium News. Yep. Gray Zone is Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate and all of those guys. And
Democracy Now?
No. I mean, I haven't paid attention to Democracy Now! Since they lied us into war in Libya and supported the terrorists in Syria. Horrible on Russiagate. And I already held my own little funeral for Amy Goodman. I feel so bad about what happened to her. What happened to her? She turned into Howard Dean, the MEK kook. I'm just for shame on her, for real. But, Tom Engelhardt has curated over the years just an incredible list of writers that write for him. And then, there are a lot of good organizations. There's probably, 100 sort of liberal and left public interest organizations that do really great work on the military-industrial complex and stuff like that. So you have people like, I'm sorry I don't remember the names of all the orgs off the top of my head. But
I love two people who reviewed your book favorably. Ron Paul, who's been a guest on our show several times, and who has his own blog. I love what he has to say, especially domestic news and economic news. And our good friend Daniel Ellsberg as well reviewed your book favorably, and he blogs. I go for him for good intelligence analysis.
I'm really proud of both of those, for sure. I promise you that.
We have about 8 or so minutes left with you, Scott. And one of the things that came out today, in the previous segment, we're talking about a money trail and this Aziza guy who has now been identified and involved with the Russians for many years. The CIA director, Gina Haspel, is supposed to be testifying in front of the 8 this morning. I think they may be on right now. I wondered what your thoughts are on both the revelation that they have now identified a man linked to the money trail, and also about the intelligence agencies testifying to Congress.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what they'll tell us. I mean, I presume, I'm sorry, I don't know about it. So I presume you're talking about closed door hearings with Haspel this morning?
Right, right. And we do have a caller. Before we get into that answer, maybe we could take the caller and see what's on their mind. Caller, go ahead with your question. Right. And we do have a Speak up, please. Before we get into that answer, maybe we could take the caller and see what's on their mind. Caller, go ahead with your question.
Thank you. This is on a related but slightly different subject. This is on a slightly different subject, going back to the earlier conversation with Mr. Horton on the interrelated corruption that's existed for so long with almost all the wars we've fought in this country, certainly in the last Cold War years and since. Is there any ray of hope? All the journalists you list and your own work are very positive, but to bring about policy and political change, given that both parties are implicated in all of this, what's the next step if one wants to bring about real change?
Thank you, caller.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll cite Ron Paul in two ways here. First of all, education is the key. People have to know the truth, and they have to be made to see that whatever traditional narrative they thought was right, it just isn't. It works like this instead. And the corruption of it is the key. It was Ike Eisenhower, the 5-star general, Supreme Allied Commander of United Nations forces in Europe in World War II, and President of the United States, Republican President of the United States, who coined the term military-industrial complex. And all that means is vested interests, special interests, who lobby for the policies that keep their pockets fat, simple as that. No different than hairdressers trying to increase the licensing requirements for other hairdressers to compete with them in the market. It's just plain old rent seeking is all it is. And, but then what's really going to change it overall? I mean, frankly, I'm sad to say I don't even have much hope that education really is the key to changing it as much as, getting the population ready for a time when we really, as Ron Paul says, just cannot afford it anymore. And that time might be right now. I mean, isn't everybody asking that, that $7 or $8 trillion we spent on the terror wars in the last 20 years, whether maybe we could have built some more hospitals instead? That occur to anybody? That maybe there's some opportunity costs when they were telling us that all these wars were free, but meanwhile they're printing so much money that they cause these giant bubbles and crashes that devastate our economy every 10 or 12 years or so. Maybe it's not worth it to try to mimic the British Empire that we once upon a time declared our own independence from. And maybe it is time to focus on ourselves. So I guess I'm contradicting myself. I do think that when supermajorities, when just the absolute common consensus of everyone is not only anti-war, but really sick and tired of it and ready to prioritize it, then it'll all come to an end. But short of that, the dollar's going to break one day, and then our soldiers going to have to hitchhike home.
It's funny you should say that because I'm preparing 2 shows, one of which is I'm getting lots of signals that within perhaps as soon as the next 90 days, we're going to see a massive devaluation of the dollar, perhaps as much as 30%, and the collapse of the U.S. economy. But back to intelligence, and I'll keep coming back to this. What can be believed? The way intelligence works, of course, you have case officers in the field, and then you have analysts like Ray McGovern, our friend Ray McGovern, who make a career out of evaluating what's called raw intelligence. I'm wondering whether intelligence agencies can police each other. Now, we know in the intel on the Russian bounty that the NSA disagreed with what other agencies were saying about the Russia-paid bounties. So can intelligence agencies be trusted to police each other? And can Congress, can the congressional oversight, intelligence oversight committees be trusted to police the veracity of intelligence?
No, of course not. And you got to nuke Langley from orbit is the only way to be sure. I mean, these guys, their entire job is lying and changing regimes and intervening in other countries, and their way of life is that the ends justify the means. Oh, and then, by the way, all of their ends are terribly destructive and counterproductive and create more enemies and chaos for the American people in every way.
Scott, is there a country out there who is doing a good job in this area?
Oh, whose intelligence agencies tell their politicians the truth but don't go around intervening in other countries? I mean, I guess so, but only because right now we have such a monopoly on the right to do so. So I guess if, you have, the intelligence agencies in Sweden conspiring against Julian Assange, but why? Because they're deputized by the United States to do so and forced by the United States to do so. And so if the Swedes were the global hegemon, would they act just, their intel agencies just like the CIA? Of course.
If I were a member,
America's the world empire now. That's all.
If I were a member of Congress trying to reach out for good intelligence, would you recommend me reaching out to Israel? Can they be trusted?
No, of course not. I mean, of all the vested interests, and the Israelis are constantly lying about everything, and numerous times, according to former Mossad officers, have completely betrayed the United States, such as when they knew good and well that the barracks were about to be bombed in Beirut in 1983 and didn't warn the Americans. In fact, there was just a story that came out in the last year that the Israelis had hired, and it's all the way proven now, it was Israelis who hired right-wing Christians to attempt to assassinate the American ambassador to Lebanon back in, I think, 1981, something like that. So, they absolutely are not trustworthy. And, look at all their claims for years that Iran is making nuclear weapons. And look at the fraud of the forged laptop, which they pretended was a laptop of an Iranian scientist that was smuggled out of Iran, which is completely debunked and forged by the Israelis.
Scott Horton, I'm afraid we are out of time. And I did want to thank you for being our guest for the last 30 minutes or so and remind our listeners that you have authored the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan.
And I love your site, antiwar.com. Again, we were talking about news you can trust. This is a source I can trust, antiwar.com.
Well, thank you both very much for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Scott. We'll be back in next month, the first Thursday in August. And we thank all of our listeners for tuning in. Again, our website, heroespatriots.org. You can hear all of our programs in archive.
And I want to thank you for supporting this community radio station, KMUD, and support, of course, the station by becoming a member or an underwriter. Thank you so much for your support.